The self-immolation of Aaron Bushnell has been a flashpoint in the political conversation in the West over the Israel-Palestine situation. And while there are many people saying many things about this particular topic, I feel as if a lot of important things are being missed in all the noise. Almost as important as the incident itself, the self-immolation, which we will certainly address in a moment, is how people have reacted to it. There have been three primary reactions to Mr. Bushnell. For those of you who do not know, he's a 25-year-old U.S. serviceman who went outside of the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C., and in an act of protest against the Israel-Palestine war in favor of Palestine, poured gasoline on himself and set himself on fire, self-immolation. There have been three primary responses to these things. There have been people trying to make him a political martyr for their own self-interested beliefs. For example, Cornel West, the famous leftist philosopher, who basically said in so many words that he died for truth and justice and that he had a extraordinary courage and commitment to what is right. Jill Stein, who is also a prominent figure on the left, the head of the Green Party and the Green Party's candidate for this current election cycle, said that he needs to rest in power. Owen Jones, who is a columnist out of the UK, very popular socialist over there, said that Aaron Bushnell died because he had too much humanity for a world run by people that don't have any. Roger Waters, the former frontman of Pink Floyd, said that he was an all-American hero. So there are some people trying to impose martyrdom upon him. There are other people that are simply mocking him. And there have been memes galore about Mr. Bushnell from both the left, mostly from the right, mocking him and just diminishing and cheapening what happened. And then there are just people that are saying he's part of this cult, a general cult of leftism. And this is just another example of how leftism is a cult. All of these responses miss several points that are not being elaborated on by commenters on the situation. And I think that it does us a disservice to simply default to our factionalist beliefs about what we think is happening and not actually engage in the hard work of applying our God-given faculties of reason towards these very sensitive and these very important issues. Before I go on, I must say this. Suicide is not a form of protest. Suicide, and I'll listen to me very closely, because this is not just a problem that Bushnell is dealing with. A lot of people, especially a lot of young people, are experiencing rates of suicidality and depression. And in that social context, this is very important. Suicide is a rejection of the inalienable condition of life. The idea is that all of us have the right to life, the right to our liberty, and the right to ourselves, our property. And these are inalienable rights. That means that your neighbor, your government, nor you have the right to take away your own rights. It's a rejection of these inalienable rights that are necessary for life to continue. And for that very reason, it is not moral, it is not courageous, it is not wonderful, it is not anything except an anti-human sentiment of the most permanent sense. But unfortunately, there are people that praise suicide and praise self-immolation and other forms of suicide as a form of political protest. That is wrong, that is incorrect, and it shows a fundamental misunderstanding of proper ethics. We'll get more to that a little bit later. But also another thing that has to be said, it shouldn't have to say this, but it has to be said. Bushnell, while I believe he was confused, and I'll get into that in a second, and he had a lot of bad beliefs, he was a human being. And human beings suffer and struggle and go through things. Every single one of you within the sound of my voice, you've struggled with something. You've gone through something. And to make memes mocking the obvious mental terror, the cognitive disorder this man was under, is to cheapen and reject his humanity and use it instead as an avatar and means of your own enjoyment. That is about as sick as someone that does decide to kill themselves for a political cause. That is sick, that is foul, and it is deeply anti-human, and it reflects a sentiment within our current culture and especially within our current political conversation, where people that are involved in politics or society at large, when they take positions that we do not personally agree with, they become little more than objects, target objects for our rage to be directed at. That is not right, and that will not help us have a better society or a better political order. So, with that said, let's talk about why I think this Bushnell thing happened, and more importantly, what it represents more generally for our society and our culture. When you combine a mentally unwell person, which Bushnell was most certainly mentally unwell, with totalizing ideas, and I'll explain what that means in a moment, you get destructive results. Whether it is the transgender Tennessee shooter that went into a private Christian school, killed a bunch of innocent little kids that had nothing to do with anything, and then we find out in the manifesto that this shooter was particularly targeting rich kids and particularly targeting white kids and viewed Christianity as something bad and horrific to their worldview. Or the Kentucky banker shooter, who this young man in his 20s decided to kill a bunch of his banking colleagues because he wanted to push the needle forward towards gun control. In fact, he quite literally said, before he went to go kill a bunch of his colleagues, that the NRA is to blame for what he did. Whether it's the transgender shooter, whether it's the Kentucky shooter, whether it's Aaron Bushnell lighting himself on fire outside the Israeli embassy. All of these distinct situations are different, but they are all motivated by totalizing worldviews. What is a totalizing worldview? I'm happy you asked. So, there are two categories of belief that human beings happen to have. There are control beliefs, and then there are totalizing ideas. Control beliefs, as defined by most psychologists, are simply beliefs that we gain in life in the process of living, in the process of socializing with people, in the process of just walking through our everyday lives. So a control belief, for example, that you may believe that chicken is delicious or whatever. Well, if you've lived through life, you've ate some good chicken or whatever, that may just be a belief that you have. Every human being has control beliefs in some way, shape, or form. They have different variations, of course. But a totalizing belief, which is a form of control belief, but a more extreme form of control belief, attaches the mind to a simplified and limited idea. Normally one idea, it can be a set of ideas, but normally one idea that motivates the individual to exclude every single other idea, every single other possibility, and every single other explanation about something in the world, and act as if their totalizing idea is the only source of truth. Now, the moment anyone does this, I don't care what their political ideology is, I don't care if they're left or right, although this happens to be a very big thing on the left. I'll explain in a second. Whenever anyone does this, they limit their ability to consider others drastically, and they put themselves in a posture where they are more willing to do destructive things to further their causes and further their ideas than what they would have done if their mind had not been impacted by a totalizing belief. The philosopher Hannah Arendt made this point that, for example, authoritarian ideologies tend to be characterized by totalizing beliefs. The Nazis, for example, gave Germans a simplified idea of the entire world, where the Nazis reduced the whole world to the myth of the white Aryan and how the white Aryan was superior to everyone else, and that justified genocide, that justified authoritarianism, that justified persecuting minorities, that justified persecuting political minorities as well, that justified persecuting Christians, because everything was of lesser importance or no importance compared to this simplified idea given to the German people by the Third Reich. We see a lot of totalizing worldviews that happen to indoctrinate people alive in our world today. The narrative that, especially the narrative that the left is pushing about the Israel-Palestine situation, is an example of a totalizing worldview. For example, a lot of people on the left are saying that Israel is a settler colonial state. Now, let me say this. I don't care what you think about Israel or about Palestine. I'm not getting involved in that fight. That is a fight that is, frankly, above my pay grade. That's not my fight. But I will say, if you are analyzing any issue through a lens that is inherently epistemologically flawed, I will call you out and I will condemn your reasoning and I will urge you to do something different. The whole idea of settler colonialism, as articulated by modern-day left-wing minds, suggests that certain groups of people, due to their position on the power hierarchy, happen to be oppressive to other groups of people who do not have that same position on the power hierarchy. Which is why you may even hear the term colonialism used outside of its traditional sense, which simply meant countries going into other countries, colonizing them, taking their resources, so on and so forth. You'll hear people say that your mind has been colonized by these different ideas that are on the power hierarchy, such as assimilation. A lot of people will say that colonialization is assimilation. Someone going into a certain country and assimilating is a form of colonialization. Even though that person's not a country or government, they're just a person, because it's about how power overtakes the mind and puts certain ideas in the mind. Why am I talking about colonialism? Because Aaron Bushnell himself actually talking about colonialism in one of his uncovered Reddit posts. In fact, I will quote him. Aaron Bushnell, who went by the Reddit username AceBush1, said that whiteness erases culture. This is part of the totalizing ideology I'm talking about that he was captured by. And he goes on to say that culture is not conformity. Culture arises spontaneously and intentionally from social interaction, and conformity stifles that process. In fact, conforming to an authoritarian prescribed culture, such as, I don't know, settler colonial culture, require the sacrifice of ethnic and the autonomy that it creates. So this entire leftist idea of settler colonialism is not just a political reality that we've seen throughout history. To them, it is ideologies, regardless of their actual impact on actual policy, that are widely popular in the culture and they believe have an unfair advantage on the power hierarchy. In other words, it's all about a power analysis that ignores every other important value and reduces everything to a conflict. That is a totalizing ideology. If you believe that the world is simply a bunch of power conflicts clashing together, and all meaning, all truth, all institutions, all governments are formed around that clash of power, and what matters is that the little guy gets up on the big guy, on the supposed oppressor, and overtakes him, then you have a totalizing worldview which completely and utterly ignores the importance of voluntary cooperation in society, which completely and utterly ignores the importance of inventiveness, which completely and utterly ignores the individual. It is not an individual-centered worldview. It is a group-centered worldview, because the groups are the ones clashing, not the individuals. And so you have this abstract notion of man that's not true. You are completely and utterly ignoring so many different things, including the complexity of certain things in history that may be glossed over by a settler colonial or a communist sort of power relationship view of history, things that just can't be accounted for by those ideas. You are completely and utterly excluding every other thing that does not conform to your worldview as being oppressive or being somewhere on the conflict hierarchy. That's what people that believe in settler colonialism absolutely do. And that's what Bushnell did, as evidenced by his Reddit post and as evidenced by his advocacy. So his mind was captured by a totalizing belief. Now, totalizing worldviews, in addition to being epistemologically unsound, in addition to limiting the amount of information that you have and therefore impacting your ability to make a good judgment, also are a prerequisite for self-sacrifice, because a totalizing worldview, by virtue of being limited, will sacrifice your ability to interact with ethics and morality in a sound way. A totalizing worldview, such as that which Bushnell had, in that worldview, only a group or an abstract-centered worldview would be at the center of his mind. And in general, only a group or an abstract-centered worldview can justify suicide in the name of pushing for a certain political project. Whereas an individual-centered worldview, or a family-centered worldview, or a worldview that admits that ethics cannot be formed without first a consideration of the concrete individual and those in his social context, that worldview, under no circumstances, can possibly permit or advocate for suicide. It couldn't possibly say that those things are courageous or good, because the foundations of both worldviews are fundamentally different. In the family worldview and the individual worldview, and I put those things together because ideally the family is this union that helps build up the individual in their more formative stages of life and prepares them for society. It's not against the individual, as some have suggested. It actually should be an enabling boon for the individual to learn about moral and social obligation within that familial context. And then as they grow up and they get out of the family household, they're able to expand what they learn in that context and use it to be a good citizen, a good person, a good moral agent. So in that worldview, your obligations and your duties are defined and they are clear. As an individual, you have the duty to respect justice towards someone else. You have the duty to uphold your contracts, to uphold your oaths. You have the duty to act in a manner that is not injurious to someone else. You have a duty to do so many different things that are responsible and necessary for the security and survival of society. In the familial context, the father has the duty to his wife and his kids. The mother has duty to her husband and her kids, so on and so forth. And in the children context, the child has a duty to their parents to respect and obey them within a certain context and the certain limitations, and to also grow and learn in a formative, in a good way within the familial context. There are clear moral relationships established in both contexts. So in the family and individual worldview, these things are clear. But in the abstract worldview, your duties and your obligations go beyond your own individual experiences, go beyond your own concrete connections, and they are centered in these abstract, faraway, group-centered ideas that you cannot tangibly touch in any case, and therefore you cannot actually fully understand what you are actually doing. When my devotion is to a cause, not to a person or a concrete individual, I can then in my mind justify doing almost anything to protect that kind of cause or to push that kind of cause forward. The philosopher Peter Singer, who is a very big voice on the left, basically said that if you have the ability to help the poor, you should just help the poor, no matter if you have a connection with them or not. But without a connection, how can you possibly expect me to be obligated to someone else? I can't be obligated to a floating idea. I have to be obligated to an actual person. But under the group-centered idea, the actual people are part of the group, and that's what your obligation is towards. It's not concrete. There are no guardrails. The only guardrail is that your pursuit of that idea is the focus of your morality and nothing else. And therefore, you can justify self-sacrifice because you are no longer the focus of the moral interaction, nor is your family or anyone concrete. This abstract fantasy becomes your focus. And that, by not putting an emphasis on the importance of self-preservation or self-refinement, by rejecting the self, leaves the self as a tool to be used for political goals, even if those goals are detrimental to your own livelihood. That is what is happening here, ladies and gentlemen. Aaron Bushnell had an abstract worldview, an abstract sense of morality that considered people in terms of groups and classes. And in that kind of morality, there's no room for self-preservation. There's no room for the individual. There's no room for anything beyond this abstract thought. And if there's no room for those things, there's no room for sound moral thinking. And therefore, under a paradigm of unsound moral thinking, you can justify self-sacrifice. That's what's going on here. Now, this is not just me talking. Let's actually look at what Aaron Bushnell had to say about Israelis that may very well lend credence to what I'm saying. Aaron Bushnell said in a Reddit post that there are no Israeli civilians or tourists who have no part in the oppression of Palestine. That idea doesn't make any sense and betrays a lack of understanding of what the oppression of Palestine even is. Israel is a settler colonialist apartheid state. All of its residents or their immediate forebears have moved there specifically to settle on stolen land whose people are being cornered and cleansed just a few miles away or right next door to the West Bank in the case of that. There are no Israelis without the genocide of the Palestinian people. This is like saying there are no Americans that didn't partake in the genocide of the Native Americans, if you want to use his argument. That's absolutely absurd. If I didn't personally undertake something in my own personal capacity, and I'm several generations removed from a certain event that occurred, or I'm many miles from a certain event that is occurring, and I have no connection with that event, how can you possibly blame me for that event? Under the abstract worldview, my actions as an individual don't matter. My existence as a person, as a nameless, faceless blob within a collective, that's what matters. And that same thinking is what enables people to justify some of the most absurd and destructive things, including suicide. That's it. That's what's happening here. And the more we don't understand this, the more we will continue to miss the mark when it comes to actually analyzing these things. The state of our society, the state of our political conversation is evidently poor if we take seriously the many remarks that have been made on all sides from all people about Bushnell's death. We need to have humanity in this moment. We need to recognize that the biggest problem facing the West right now, the biggest problem facing the United States right now, my country, is that we lack moral education. We lack moral understanding. We lack a sound appreciation of philosophy and first principles. And most importantly, many of us, not all of us, but many of us lack common humanity towards those who are within factions that are opposed to our own worldviews. All of those things will continue to produce misunderstanding. They will continue to produce confused moral thinking. They will continue to produce so many horrific things, unenlightening takes on issues like this, until we actually decide to stop them, until we actually decide to assert what it actually means to be a human being and to empathize and understand what other human beings are going through, what it actually means to be controlled by a totalistic ideology, what it actually means, my friends, to see beyond your factional lens and embrace a new perspective that may give you more color in the world, as opposed to everything just being dark and gray. Until that point, I think Mr. Bushnell and people like him will continue to fall in the pitfall of giving themselves over to a totalistic worldview, rejecting their own humanity, and using seeing themselves rather, as utilitarian objects to be used to further causes, quite frankly, they don't understand. Most Americans do not understand anything going on in Palestine whatsoever. Most of them just do not. And yet they have this idea given to them by media factions that are sympathetic towards a certain tribe that gives them a false understanding of what's going on in these issues, and then furthers the entrenchment of the totalistic worldview within their minds, hearts, and souls. It's a tragedy. It's intellectual abuse, and it must stop. My friends, we need a revolution of the mind. What happened to Bushnell was sad, tragic, and horrific, but it is the consequence of totalistic worldviews, marrying mental illness, and also marrying a complete and utter ignorance and rejection of the self as the locus of value and social interactions. We must teach that the individual is important. We must teach that morality that goes beyond our own subjective opinions is important. And we must teach, most importantly, that not having an abstract worldview, but having a concrete worldview based on facts and based on sound thinking will always be a better option than to simply have a worldview based on your own emotions and your own mind and your own fantasies about what you think is happening. My friends, like this video, comment, share, subscribe, do whatever you can to help get our message out there. Study history, my friends. Study philosophy. Remain morally convicted, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.